Abraham and Sarah are familiar characters to us, but we rarely read their whole story in one go on one Sunday, or even hear it told from start to finish, partly because it does span about 14 chapters of Genesis, so it's a long one, detailed one, and typically in the Bible, or in our reflections based on our readings, especially in the New Testament, their story is mentioned to support a particular point. And it does happen a lot in the Gospels and in the epistles. And so what happens more often is that we would read the epistle that says something like, entertain strangers, offer hospitality, because they could be angels. And then that reminds us of the episode we read today about Abraham and Sarah entertaining strangers, and then we reflect on the story. But I rarely hear the story told from the beginning till the end. And if we do get a chance to do that, it's actually often in Lent, because Lent is the season of remembering our own relationship with God and the promises we might have made based on our faith, and God's promises to us that are the basis for our faith. So now Lent is behind us, and suddenly every 3 years in June, we read on several consecutive Sundays the story of just a few episodes of the story. So today I thought what I would do is actually take the opportunity to review the full, maybe not the full story, but at least the arc of it, and perhaps also try to focus on Sarah's perspective, because again, it's very often positioned as the story of Abraham, because he is the one in the text with whom God speaks and interacts primarily through these covenants, through these agreements that God continually, through which God continually reinforces his promises. But Sarah is there through it all. She's the one who, like Abraham, at a fairly advanced age, although not as advanced as where the story ends, but at 65 years of age, I don't want to say it's advanced, but I want to say that it's the age at which you begin to appreciate perhaps the familiarity, the family ties particularly, the grandchildren perhaps, the home, your gardens. Maybe she had a good tent pitched somewhere that she decorated. I don't know what kind of a dwelling actually they would have had in Mesopotamia, which is where their story begins. But at the time, Abraham is 75 and Sarah is 65. So you're well established in your community. And in your local, in your home. You have a home and a family. They leave it all behind, and they travel to Canaan, which is where God said their descendants one day would inherit the land, would settle. And Abraham trusts that promise. This is like well before Israel existed, as we know it now, or even in the Bible. This is before any kind of stone tablets or circumcision. This is purely Abraham and his ability to interact with the transcendent, his openness to hear those insights and recognizing that they are not his delusions. They're not just his mind telling him to do something crazy, even though it might actually look like that. And it might have looked like that to Sarah, who was uprooted together with him, crossed deserts, but also not deserts, because even if the climate was arid, although we don't know in those times, maybe it was a little bit more forested, which probably also meant more wild animals, and also more rival clans and tribes who populated the so-called desert. So there were multiple conflicts in which eventually the family found themselves. There was danger. And then they did make it to Canaan, where a famine struck. That kind of rings a bell with the future turn in the story of Israel, where actually the very same thing happened after they had already settled. There was a famine, and they had to go to Egypt. The 12 brothers, the 11 brothers had to find Joseph in Egypt because there was nothing to eat in their land. And that's how Israel ends up in Egypt, kind of again and again in the story, in the overall scriptural narrative. But here, this is the beginning. This is before Abraham and Sarah had their 12 great-grandchildren, the ones who then escaped into Egypt when their time came. But here, they are in Egypt, and Sarah suffers a danger that's more unique to her as a woman because she was apparently strikingly beautiful, and Abraham was concerned that that would put him at risk. And so he tells everyone that she was his sister, twice in the story, not once, which may have been somewhat like a half-truth, because there is a passage in Genesis that outlines the complex relationship or family tree that already existed. And so she was more like his niece. But I guess in the olden days, you could call any female relative your sister, which Abraham did, and Sarah was captured and taken to Pharaoh's palace. And there is a beautiful prayer that is recorded in the Jewish tradition that's outside the Torah, which outlines this in great detail, actually, this episode. And it's one of the few prayers and the few moments when Sarah is given a voice explicitly. And so it's in parallel to everything else that happens between Abraham and God. And she recites this plea, this prayer to God to keep her protected as well as Abraham. And we hear a little bit more explicitly her emotional state and her fear, and a bit of a sense of a betrayal that Abraham is safe and she is captured and she doesn't know what will happen to her. But eventually they do escape again. She escapes out of the palace unharmed, and they leave Egypt, and bit by bit, their household grows in wealth. So there is still no child at this point, despite the promise given to Abraham that your descendants will one day inhabit Canaan, but there is no descendants, not even a hint of it yet. However, there is a nephew called Lot, and there is a lot of servants, trained fighters that Abraham maintains, a team of them, and all those animals that they herd. So they're semi-nomadic people, and they move with their flocks. And at some point, the flock grows so huge that Lot and Abraham parts ways. There's just not enough resources to support all those creatures, and they're grazing. And it's at that time that Lot gets captured, which shows us again that this was a dangerous way of living, and Abraham rescues him and meets a mystical figure called Melchizedek. We read his name in the New Testament texts as well as in the Psalm. And Melchizedek appears, and here we have the first example of hospitality, the theme of hospitality that gets woven into the story, where Melchizedek gives to Abraham bread and wine and the blessing. And Abraham gives him the 10th of the spoils that he collected when rescuing Lot, but actually also gaining more out of it. So what does that exchange remind you of? Bread, wine, and blessing, and then a tithe given back. It's precisely a foreshadowing of what we do now as a church, in the church. So it's interesting how in this ancient text, before any priests were established in Israel, because there was no Israel, before any Christian church, because again, it would be millennia till it's established, we have this foreshadowing of how God manifests himself or herself through human hospitality, through human exchanges, and blesses us through what we do with each other. So after that, we've got a series of covenants through which God reaffirms his promise to Abraham and Sarah. So still no children. At some point, God invites Abraham to look at the stars and imagine that that's how many descendants he will one day have, which is basically innumerable. And God asks Abraham to sacrifice animals at this point, not his son yet, but it's this animal sacrifice, and God passes through the carcasses of the animals in the form of a flaming torch and a pillar of smoke. Kind of, again, foreshadowing what there will be in the desert when people leave Egypt several generations later. And so God keeps reaffirming, yes, you will have children, yes, my promises are true, without really delivering yet. And decades pass. So if this all starts at 65, and at the age of 99 or something, like the last decade of Sarah's life, there is a child, that's a long time. And then still it's not coming to fruition. There's one more covenant by which God decides to change the names of Abraham and Sarah. Have you ever noticed that they start out as Abram, really something more like Avram, and Sarai, something like that, and then they become Abraham and Sarah with an H rather than an I at the end. So the meaning of the names doesn't change much. Well, it changes for Abraham from an exalted father to the father of many, just by adding that one letter. And for Sarah, she was a princess to begin with, and she kind of stays a princess. There's not a huge change. But the change is that letter comes from the verb to be. So in Semitic languages, words are made out of 3 consonants, which is like a basic shape of a word. And then you add sounds around those 3 consonants to make it an adjective or a noun, or to derive other words from it. So the 3 consonantal shape for the verb to be has a h sound. And it's in the middle. So it's like central to God. And God's name is the one who is, I am. So that verb to be is also God's name. Then you take the central consonant out of it, add it to human names, and signify this life of God breathed into those 2 humans. But still no child. And so it just keeps going until Sarah and Abraham find themselves in what we read today. In the tent, in the heat of the day, there's some shade offered by the great oaks, and the 3 guests come. And the Bible says it's man, or at least that's what Abraham and Sarah saw. Later on, the epistle says it's the angels. And in the famous icons written following a specific pattern one of them you might know by Rublev, who established that pattern, have the three angels sitting around the table. And that is representing God as a triune being in the form of the angels, but the angels are the guests of Abraham. So the icon has two names, the guests of Abraham and the Holy Trinity. And the reason we make this association is because, interestingly, in all this exchange with the angels, or men, Abraham sometimes addresses them by a singular name and sometimes by a plural. So he kind of alternates between one and three, or one and many, which is really cool because he seems to have a sense that these three men are somehow one, that they're unified, at least maybe by one message, one purpose to them. And the message is now very specific. Not that you'll have a child one day or your descendants will be numerous. It's within a year that you will finally have this baby. And Sarah, peeking out from the doorway of the tent, laughs. I can imagine why. My grandmother is 98. I know many of you, of parishioners, are in your 90s. How would you feel about staying up every 2 hours, day and night, to feed this baby, chase a toddler, deal with teenage tantrums, like all of that after enduring the pregnancy and surviving the childbirth before the era of today's medical advances? I don't want to do it now at half that age. Like, I don't want to do any of this again. And so that laughter, I think we take it sometimes as a form of unbelief or as an evidence of Sarah's unbelief. But I think it's more just like how ridiculous the whole proposition sounds and basically what cost new life entails. And so to me, this story is about the cost of new life. It's actually not about like another fertility miracle. Like last week, we read about a woman who had chronic bleeding. And there are so many of these women at every significant turn in the history of Israel's relationship with God. There is somebody who can't have a baby and then does. Even Mary shouldn't really have a baby at that time and does, miraculously. But so many of us can't. And so many people have kids but don't have a great relationship with them. So many people lose children. So many people outlive children into old age and say that the worst part is actually not being tired, keeping track of medications, dealing with insomnia, hardly walking, like all the physical stuff that we think Sarah has. But the not having anybody who knows you from who you truly were decades ago. So children are not really a solution for everything. Children are not there to make us happy. And I don't think that's what makes Sarah and Abraham happy, even though they both laugh, by the way. Abraham's laughter is taken as delight, and Sarah's as unbelief. But really, both mean that they understand something, that this baby will be a sign of new life, of possibility of new life for everybody. And so the story applies to everyone. Everybody who's ever thought this is all there is to my life, everybody who has thought that this is all that I can contribute, that there's nothing new that God will do in my life. I think the birth of this child, I don't really read it literally. I read it as a symbol of the possibility of new life that we don't see until we step out of the inside of our tent of our concern with today's challenges that we all have. And it applies to relationships, health, any other psychological struggles. But it's not going to be solved here and now. What I mean by new life, it's not that something great will happen tomorrow and we must hope and wait. No, I think God's plan reaches beyond this life. The real hope is that we will see its fulfillment. We will see the fulfillment of God's promises to us, which centers on relationship with Him. But it's not even for here and now. Abraham and Sarah never saw all those descendants. And Sarah died shortly after. There was still the episode where Isaac almost died, almost being murdered by Abraham. So imagine that, to add to everything she's carried all her life. And then she died, and so you could say that she never saw the fulfillment of her hope and dreams. But we do. We do when we are together in heaven enjoying God's hospitality, having offered ours through all our lives to each other. And so today, when we have our picnic, when we offer our hospitality to strangers, may we see God's presence, God's signs of new life, new birth in this community where we don't know where we're heading collectively or individually, but through the work of our hands, through the perhaps too many sandwiches for us gathered, as there was way too much bread that Sarah baked for the 3 people, we will see that God promises life as abundant as this display of food, but it's intangible, spiritual, and more for eternity than it is for here. Although we see glimpses here. So 24 liters of flour was the bread. Francis, I always ask you at this point, how many liters of flour for the tortillas? 90 for all the Christmas kitchen tortillas. This is a third for just 3 men, not the entire North Toronto. And the sandwiches I saw in the kitchen, they multiplied like those fishes and loaves. They always do, because God works through our hands so that we, over a meal, can sense His presence amongst us. Thanks be to God.